You're listening to Trek FM.
Welcome, listeners, to another episode of From There to Here, Trek FM's Rewatch podcast, where we examine all 729 episodes, starting chronologically with Enterprise and ending with Beyond. My name is Caitlin, and with me I have Mike. How are you doing today?
I'm doing okay. How are you?
I'm doing all right. Thanks for asking. And today on the docket is another Voyager episode and another Deep Space Nine episode. First up, we have Deep Space Nine, Statistical Probabilities, and then we will have Voyager's Concerning Flight. So, without further ado, let's get on to the summary for Statistical Probabilities. Try saying that 5 times fast. Okay, so this is a Bashir episode. Revelations had come to light earlier in the story where Bashir is genetically enhanced. And after the fallout, the Starfleet Institute decided to send out some more genetically enhanced people to Deep Space Nine, and viewers will realize that these are not as well adaptive. These people have not adapted as well, rather, than Bashir has, and they have had some difficulties. So they've had to be institutionalized, and the doctor in charge of their care thought meeting Bashir, who has been a part of society and able to be a productive member of Starfleet, would be good for them. They get access to some Dominion War information after deducing what happened to Damar simply by watching his speech, and they come up with a few suggestions. Some of them are really helpful, like what the Dominion is up to, and others, like the Federation should just go ahead and surrender, are not so helpful. And Bashir has to come to terms with how to identify with these people, but also the Starfleet duty gets in the way, and it's a really, I think it's actually a pretty good episode. Mike, what did you think of this?
Yeah, I like this episode a lot. The stuff in terms of seeing, the other people who are genetically enhanced, like Bashir, and him interacting with them, I think is fine. But the thing that I really respond to is, their analysis of events and sort of like playing the long game and everything, and reaching these conclusions which span, decades. Yes. And what you do with that information and how you process it and everything like that, like even down to just like little things like, their analysis of the speech and what they're trying to get and why they're trying to get it and all that stuff. It reminds me a lot of Moneyball. Did you ever see that movie?
I'm sorry, Mike. That's the second movie in a row that I haven't seen.
No, that's okay. But definitely check out Moneyball. It's amazing. I mean, the book is even better. But it's about these guys who, I mean, basically, baseball teams decided that in terms of like constructing their teams, instead of hiring a bunch of like old athletes who are looking at people's swing and saying like, that guy, he's got a strong jaw, yeah, let's hire him. They basically hired a bunch of like mathematicians and stuff from like MIT and Yale and whatever, and said, let's look at the numbers, let's play this out over the span of 162 games and what happens when we put different pieces together. And they basically just started crunching numbers and ended up in this case building a team which could compete with the other teams
and the Red Sox, yes.
Yeah, even though they had absolutely no money. And I mean, that to me, I always loved that story. I loved the movie and everything like that. And when I was watching this here again, I was like, oh, wow, this is... it's Moneyball, And I mean, it really is. And it's really cool. And, even though obviously they're bringing in sort of like a moral aspect to it in terms of like, are you willing to sacrifice, X amount of people in order to ensure the continuation of society 100 years down the road or whatever. And I mean, that's definitely something which the episode is about at its heart. I at the same time was kind of like siding with, you know, Bashir's crew or whatever you want to call them, where they're like, look, we did we're right. We are right. I'm sorry, guys. You know, and you know, Bashir's example of like, you didn't even know that she was going to do this. It's like, okay, fine. But if we're going to crunch numbers, they're still probably right. And I don't know. I mean, it's a really interesting concept. And I really like seeing it play out. I like seeing sort of like the process. And this episode, it works for me quite a bit.
Yes.
I don't know, what did you think about it?
I actually enjoyed this episode a lot too. I was worried that they weren't going to depict Jack and his comrades well. They were going to go into stereotypes, but it seemed like everything was balanced. I really liked Patrick and how innocent he was. In terms of the crux of the episode, it was really interesting how flatly Cisco and O'Brien refused to surrender, and I totally understand that. What came to mind when I watched this episode was actually a Revolutionary War battle, the Battle of Bunker Hill. And I live in Boston, in the neighborhood where the battle took place. And every year we have a parade celebrating this battle. Now, they lost the battle. The British eventually took the hill that they were fighting for. But it was a Pyrrhic victory. The British lost so many soldiers in taking this small hill that they realized they needed to take the colonists serious. They weren't just a bunch of farmers with pitchforks, as what the crown thought they were. And in terms of the war going on outside of this episode, it's like you can crunch the numbers all you like, but you cannot assign a variable to the human element. There's going to be emotions. The Alpha Quadrant is the Federation's home. They're not going to be willing to give up their agency and surrender just to preserve life in the very long game. You know, a lot of the people calling the shots are humans, and they're gonna be wanting to go down swinging, essentially. If it means that they're gonna lose, then so be it, but they're not gonna just lay down their weapons. And I totally could see their justification. You know, in this case, the needs of the many in the very long game do not outweigh the needs of the few in the short game.
Yeah, I can see that. I mean, I and if I were put in, you know, Cisco's position or whatever, I wouldn't agree to it either. But there's a part of me, you know, which thinks like they're right, you know. But I guess we'll see. I don't know. We've got another 2 years of Deep Space Nine. We'll see whether or not they're right.
Oh yes, yeah. Context is everything. To watch this in the stream of everything without knowing future sight, yeah. What would happen if they had decided to just surrender? Would it, you know, this show would be completely different.
Yep, for sure.
So, moving on, we have our last Voyager episode of the block, and that is Concerning Flight. It's an episode that involves the holodeck. Janeway is on her, I can't keep track of how many different holodeck adventures she has, but this one involves Leonardo da Vinci, and it is an interesting premise. But she is doing a simulation where they have just tried flying and failed when Voyager is under attack and is essentially mugged. Half of their technology is stolen by these aliens who are selling it on a planet, and in tracking down their computer core and the mobile emitter and other technology that they need to get back, Janeway and Tuvok encounter the Da Vinci hologram, who's using the mobile emitter and thinks he's in the New World, and he's designing things for his patron, who turns out to be the seller who orchestrated the mugging in the first place. Mike, what did you think of this episode?
This episode doesn't really work for me too much. I mean, I think that, you know, more than anything, they were just like, let's try to get, you know, Da Vinci and Janeway on an adventure together, and that's, and it's like, okay, that's fine. That's an interesting enough premise, but I don't think that it really works on the whole. And I also think that, at the end with the, flying machine and whatever, it's just a little too cheesy. I'm just kind of like sitting there like, oh God, you guys, no, don't do that. That's just too over the top. That's too saccharine for me. On the whole, I guess I just didn't like the episode. I did like the scene with the doctor where he's like, "So what's going on? What's going on that ship there?" Because he's stuck in sick bay and has cabin fever or whatnot. I thought that was amusing, but on the whole, this episode doesn't really work for me. What about you?
I can totally see your point of view. I think of the Voyager episodes that we've discussed in this block, this is the weakest one. My biases would allow me to say that for sure. It's an interesting concept, an interesting premise. Like, what would a hologram think if they were if they slapped the mobile emitter on and actual real world interaction? That is an interesting concept, but not the best execution. The only thing I would say is seeing this episode again reminded me of how much I wish this actually happened more often to Voyager. The concept of the whole Delta Quadrant pushing back, like we had Year of Hell earlier and now this, and just make it a little bit more distinctive than what TNG, Creature Comforts, all of the holodeck rations and fresh food they could have, or replicator rations rather. They don't have to worry about energy. So it was just nice to see the ship Voyager put in a situation where they had to compensate and, hobble along until they could track down their technology. So, like I said, interesting premise, not the best execution, though.
Yeah, I think this is an episode which probably looked a lot better on paper than it did, in actual practice. But, what can you do? They can't all be winners, I guess.
No, they can't, and this is certainly not a stinker. Like, I usually try to find something good in everything, even Resurrection from a couple days ago, but it's definitely an interesting position to be put in. Like, what would have been like in the writer's room, rather, knowing that you have to churn out all of these stories by a certain time, and some things they can't all be winners, basically.
Yeah, especially with Star Trek, where you have 26 episodes a season. That's insane.
Yes.
For them to do that much. I mean, and there's going to be, a bit of a drag, in the middle. There's going to be those episodes which they're just getting out just because they're there,
Yes.
And, what can you do? But hey, I mean, if you're going to do an episode like that, whatever. If you have a chance to get John Rhys-Davies, in your episode, then you do that, right? So
yes, and he actually does a really good job with Da Vinci. He's one of the highlights. I know they bring him back for other episodes, but this is definitely the one where he's the main focus.
Yeah, this is his chance to shine. And I do like that idea of sort of like someone from the past, especially someone like Da Vinci, who's like so
open-minded almost.
Yeah, and forward thinking, like seeing these new technologies and just having his mind blown, like, and trying to process it in like his terms. I think about that a lot, like even with just like myself, like, if we take it back like 20 years and someone were to tell like, 16-year-old me, like one day there will be this thing called the internet with this thing called Netflix where you can stream every episode of Star Trek whenever you want. I'd be like, are you kidding me? That's insane. That's the coolest thing ever. How does that work?
Exactly.
I mean, so I do like that kind of element, to this episode, but I think that the story and everything is not good enough for the concept itself.
Yeah, it basically falls flat into a forgettable episode where next episode of From There to Here, you'll have even forgotten that Concerning Flight was on the previous episode. But that just that kind of happens with Voyager, I have to admit. Like, my biases have allowed me to say that, yeah, sometimes you just get a stinker, but...
Yep, what can you do?
So, listeners, this is my last episode of the block, but you'll hear me in the future. Mike, however, is sticking on for another block with Davis, and tomorrow they will be covering the magnificent Ferengi and Mortal Coil. So, until then, Mike, where can listeners find you?
You can find me on Twitter at Mumbles3K, and you can also find me here on Trek FM doing Stage 9 with John Mills, where we talk about the people who make Star Trek.
And I'm on Twitter at Walsh Caitlin, that's my last name, first name, and then I will be popping into the Babel Conference. I'm currently listening to the backlog of To the Journey, since I'm such a Voyager fan.
To the Journey!